Okay, so let's talk about the investment game. This is a game used by behavioral economists to look at how people interact with each other. So this is the game you just played. So there's a first mover, there's a second mover. You don't know who each other are. That's what the black line between signifies, is that you can't see each other. The first mover, everybody's given $10 to start with, or 10 coins, or 10 whatever. And the first mover is told you can pass any amount X between 0 and 10, from none to all of what you've got, to the second mover. And whatever you pass gets tripled in between. So if you pass, say, 1, the second mover gets 3. If you pass 2, the second mover gets 6, and so on. And then the second mover is given the option to pass back any amount Y between 0 and that 3x, whatever it is they received from the first mover. And then the game's over. Right? So we can represent this as a sequential game in terms of the game theory that we discussed previously. So the first mover is the blue dot, and they have the option to send nothing. If they do that, everybody goes home with the $10 they started with, right? Or they can send some amount X that's between 0 and 10. If they send something to the second player, then the second player has the option to send back nothing, which means the first player goes home with 10 minus X, so whatever they passed, and the second player goes home with the whole amount of their 10 that they started with, plus 3 times what the first player sent them, right? Or the second player can choose to send back some amount Y that's between 0 and the full 3 times what they were sent. So in that case, the first player goes home with their 10 that they started with, minus the X that they sent, but then plus the Y that was returned to them, right? And the second player goes home with the 10 they started with, plus the 3X that they were sent, and then minus the Y that was sent, that they sent back. So if the first mover passes something to the second mover, which one of these is the better strategy for the second mover? How will they maximize what they go home with? Just keep it all, right? Pass nothing back, because you don't want to have to subtract out that Y over here. So this is the strategy that the second mover would choose, which means what's the best thing for the first mover to do? Just not send anything. And so, in fact, we get a Nash equilibrium that says the game should go, if the players are rational, the game should go like this. Nothing happens. Everybody goes home with the $10 they started with. But in behavioral economics, we've played this game with hundreds of people around the world, and we find that that's not what happens. Is that what all of you did? Just hang on to your 10? Some of you may have, but others of you actually passed something, right? And some of you, as second movers, actually passed something back. You did something that economists would say was irrational. You gave up money or points for you because there was no money involved. And so what we measure with this game is actually a bit of psychology, or the intersection between psychology and economic decision making, behavioral economics. So we can measure on a scale of 0 to 10 how trusting that first mover is. Because if you don't trust that the second mover will send anything back, you don't send them anything. If you really trust that, you know what, I think they'll send me some back, then you might send them all 10, because it gets tripled. If you send them 10, it gets tripled. Now they've got 30, they can send you back 15, and everybody ends up better off at the end, right? So if you trust that they might do that, then you'll send them more. So I can measure with this game on a scale of 0 to 10 how trusting you are. And then with the second mover's behavior, I can measure on a scale of 0 to 3x how trustworthy you are. Because the second mover knows, hey, that first guy trusted me enough to send me something. Let me reward that trust by sending them something back. right? And so you can either be trustworthy and return some of what you know was entrusted to you, or you can take it and run. And so I can measure by the second mover's response how trustworthy they are. And traditional economics doesn't really have a place for things like trust and trustworthiness. But in behavioral economics, we bring those things into the picture and see that, hey, people don't necessarily behave the way the traditional economist said was rational, because there are other things going on. This leads to some of my research. So when I was working on my master's degree way back in 2010, I had to do an internship, and my specialization at that point was in economic development, and so I ended up in West Africa, in the country of Liberia. And I lived there for about a semester doing some economic development sort of research. While I was there, I was in a town called Saclapia, I'll show it to you on a map in a second, which had been the recruiting and training ground for child soldiers during Liberia's civil war that lasted 14 years and ended in 2003. And so at the end of the war, a lot of these former child soldiers settled back down here in Saclapia, and so a lot of the people that I lived and worked with, as we were sitting around a fire at the end of the day, would tell stories of having been soldiers when they were children. And so when I came home and started working on my Ph.D. in economics, I was learning about this investment game in one of my classes, and I thought to myself, you know what, I bet this has implications for my friends in West Africa. I bet that because of the stuff those people went through as kids, they find it harder to trust than the rest of us might, or harder to be trustworthy than the rest of us might. Maybe they want to hang on to what they've got. And so as we started discussing the economic implications of trust, so an economist by the name of Kenneth Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize a few years back for economics, said that every economic transaction involves some level of trust. And you can think about this in your own life, even something as simple as showing up for work, right? You show up, you put in your 8 hours, no one's standing right next to you and paying you for every minute that you work, right? You're trusting that if I work hard and get the job done at the end of the pay cycle, 2 weeks, 1 month, whatever it is, someone's going to pay me. And hopefully they are trustworthy, and at the end of the pay cycle, they do pay you for the work that you did. Now, if you're on their side and you've hired someone, you trust they're going to do the job that you've hired them to do, if you're going to pay them to do it, right? So there's trust involved. Anytime goods or services exchange hands, if you ever order anything on eBay, you pay for it, you trust it's going to come, right? If you're a seller on eBay, you mail the thing, you trust they're going to pay for it, right? There's trust involved in every economic interaction. And so if we're concerned about people's economic well-being and economic health, the ability to trust others and to be found trustworthy are super important to that sort of story and that equation. And so I went over to West Africa and studied trust and trustworthiness among former child soldiers using this investment game approach. So just because I have to, here are the acknowledgments. This was part of my dissertation, and a lot of people helped. So here's a map of Liberia. Up here in the corner is the whole country, and this is zoomed in on the northeast side. So if you remember during the Ebola crisis a few years ago, you probably heard a lot about Monrovia, the capital city of Liberia, which is here on the coast, the red dot here. I was way up in the opposite corner of the country, in a town called Saclapia, right here where this star is. Saclapia looks like this, dusty red roads. This is a taxi cab on that truck. Those are human beings that are probably on there for a several hour ride. And this is the inside of the building where I did my work. Here's proof that I was there. There's my face. So this is a snapshot of the economy, some of the economic activity in Saclapia. Every Tuesday, they have a giant outdoor market where anything you need for the week, you buy it on Tuesday. So there's plantains, there's rice and beans, and there's clothes. These people are looking at in the background there. Shoes, just anything you might need, you get it on Tuesday. And this market is gigantic. gigantic. It goes as far as the eye can see. All of this in the background here, these are tent tops, all the way back to the horizon of just stuff upon stuff to buy. So this is where I went, and this was my third trip there, so I already had some contacts to make this happen. And so I worked with former child soldiers. It's important that we get on the same page. What the heck does that mean? So I used the UNICEF definition of a child soldier. It's anyone under the age of 18 who's involved in a regular or irregular armed force. So they could be part of the actual national military, or they could be part of a militia, or a lot of the folks that I talked to were just sort of handed a gun and told, stand here on the road and don't let anyone pass. So they were like a town guard. All of that counts. And they could have served in any capacity. They could have been a cook for the Army. They could have been, a lot of them were porters, so it was their job to go from camp to the front lines carrying ammunition or carrying messages, things like that. Or they could have actually been on the front line, but any capacity counts. The definition for UNICEF, of course, includes both men and women. But just to sort of keep the statistics easier, so I didn't have to try to tease out gender effects on trust and trustworthiness, I stuck only to men in my study. So why is this important? I told you it mattered to me because I knew these people, but then why is it something that's worthwhile to pursue as an economist? Because other people care about it too. So lack of trust among former child soldiers shows up in a lot of studies. So in psychology, in anthropology, even in literature, in poetry and short stories, this is a theme that comes up. But what I found was that not many people had studied this and the economic impacts. And very few had studied it using a control group, meaning I wanted to go in and look at not only the child soldiers, but those who weren't child soldiers and compare them to each other. And then sort of the lasting reason, the policy application, is that if we can understand the impacts of child soldiering, this was when I went, it was 11 years after the end of the war, then maybe, just maybe, we can do a better job of reintegrating these people into society after they go through these sorts of things. So the war in Liberia was over, but we know that these things continue to happen around the world, that there are still children fighting. And even here in America, there are children in households who are enduring war. They're enduring violence in their homes, things that they're either actually part of, they're a victim or perpetrator, or that they're just bystanders for. And if we can discover some of the lasting impacts of these things, then maybe we can do something to help mitigate those negative impacts. So that's sort of the backstory of why I wanted to do this study. So I went and I played the investment game with 200. So this game that you guys just played, exactly the way you guys just played it, except with Liberian dollars instead of American money. And I did this with 240 male subjects, some of them child soldiers, some of them adult soldiers, so they did fight but not under the age of 18, and some of them who didn't fight at all, right? And I studied them. I put some as first movers and some as second movers so that I could look at differences in both trust and trustworthiness among these three groups. What I expected, so that's a lot of words, but it boils down to what I expected from what psychologists have said and what I kind of thought might be the case was that child soldiers would be both less trusting and less trustworthy than the other groups. But I was surprised. What I found was that in terms of trust, there's no difference between the child soldiers and the other groups, and in fact, the non-soldiers were less trusting than the adult soldiers. And then in trustworthiness, this I kind of expected, so everybody was trustworthy. The more they were sent, the more they sent back. The child soldiers were less trustworthy than the adult soldiers, but then the non-soldiers weren't any different from the adult soldiers. It's sort of the unexpected story here is that non-soldiers are less trusting than adult soldiers. They're no different from the child soldiers, and non-soldiers are no different from adult soldiers in terms of trustworthiness. It's unexpected, but it's not unbelievable. So in a war like Liberia's that lasted 14 years and destroyed the entire country, everybody fought. And so what the story I sort of land on here is that there may be some outsider effect, where if you're one who didn't fight, then you feel like the war was done to you. You didn't have a part in it. Or you didn't form those sort of bonds and brotherhood that these other people who fought alongside each other have. And so you, in the end, are the one who's left sort of hanging out as the outsider of this society that's been through this long thing together. The policy application here, the important part, is that, hey, now that we've uncovered what we didn't expect, that the non-soldiers are actually the ones with the worst outcomes. And I have another study where I look at their educational and labor market, so their wages, that sort of stuff, outcomes. And in that paper, I even find that the non-soldiers have worse outcomes. We don't need to leave these people out. So previously, when at the end of the war in Liberia, the UN and the US come in and they start these reintegration aid programs where they give people money to go to school, they give them tools to start a farm or to start a business, but the ticket to that aid was you had to disarm. You bring your gun, your weapon, and you get aid. Who does that leave out? It leaves out the non-soldiers, the ones who didn't have a weapon. But what we find is 11 years later, the non-soldiers are still lagging behind the soldiers. In the future, it's important that we don't forget these folks who maybe didn't have an active role in the fight, but who were no less victims of what happened. And this applies in this sort of war in the home for American children. Maybe the child was not actually a victim of the violence or didn't perpetrate the violence, but the fact that they had to hang out in that house where it was happening, the fact that their homes were ripped apart because of it, means they are no less victims, and they need no less aid when the situation is over, to help reintegrate them, to help try to make their life as normal as possible moving forward. And this is why I love what I do. It's not because, oh cool, supply and demand, and it goes all the time to equilibrium, but it's because economics gives us a toolbox for studying real questions that really matter to real people in the world. So this is my sort of be an economist spiel, but at least take an upper level econ course where you can start to see how we've just scratched the surface of economics. Take an upper level course where you see how that stuff applies to these sort of real questions that you have about healthcare, about organ donation, about how we choose our pair of jeans. Whatever real questions you have, economics has a toolbox for answering them. And that's why I love what I do.